What they make clear is that although the lord did own everything, the villagers expected to buy certain customary rights to use the land.
Colne Priory owned Chalkney Wood, every single twig. This is where we work.
Sarah Harrison is one of a team that's created a website of all the existing records.
There is, for example, 8p for the underbrush. Those are the twigs and so on. Sold to Simon Buckier this year in the woods of Chalkney, and of 14p as the bark there, sold to William Seeley this year.
So underbrush, that would be used for kindling and things?
That's right, yes. Or even fencing. I mean, you know, twigs and what have you used for fencing. There's 6 and 8p as the farm of the Bast in Chalkney, as let to John Wheeler Baster of Holstead.
What is Bast?
Bast is the inner bark of mainly the lime tree.
So anyway, we just cut this pry with a bit of help from a bill hook in order to separate the bast from the outer bark. And it's in a question of peeling the bast, or bast.
Simon Leatherdale works for the Forest Enterprise. He's busy returning Chalkney Wood to what it might have been like centuries ago.
That's a piece of bast, and they would have been twisted to form ropes. The local economy had to have this wood. If it didn't have this wood, there would be no local economy. The local people would have no form of heating their buildings. They would have no fencing material, they would have no building material, so they absolutely depended upon it in the literal sense.
In Suffolk now, to look at a disused military airbase of all things. Today, voicing rights in how land is used often has more to do with controversial planning issues. The Bentwaters airfield near Rendlesham may be developed into an international airport, and many local residents are unhappy about it. Two of its opponents are Rachel Bridges and Michael Flint.
Well, this is the Bentwaters airfield that the Americans established at the beginning of the Cold War. At first, the Americans merely took over the old RAF facilities, but they've grown and built, and it is now an absolutely enormous site. But the land has recently been bought by a series of overseas corporations, owned ultimately by a family of Lebanese jewelers who are living in Bangkok. And they want to make this an international air park with a takeoff about every 3 minutes throughout the day. You know, we have a huge tourist industry here, and you can't have planes flying low, taking off and landing all the time without upsetting tourists.
Michael and Rachel are sure the redevelopment can be stopped if they can prove there was common land here, which the community had to give up for the airfield.
We know what's happened over the last 30 years. It's been an airbase and now it isn't. We want to know what's happened here for 100 years.
Well, if the supporters of the scheme argue historical precedent, why shouldn't Michael and Rachel? We'll catch up with them later. So much of medieval Suffolk was owned by the church. As I drove through it with Phillip Schofield, I began to realise just how much the ownership and use of our land has changed since the Middle Ages. Back then, there was an open field system, by which the common people rented strips from the lord and farmed them in unfenced fields. It was an arrangement that lasted for centuries. I suppose the first big sign of change in ownership came in 1536, when Henry VIII started to close the monasteries. He took away their lands, and the abbeys fell into ruins, like this one at Bury. If you look at the documents of that time, you can see that whilst existing landowners increased their stake, there were also new types of landowner, such as merchants and lawyers. But the biggest change was undoubtedly enclosure. Ever since the Middle Ages, a gradual process of fencing off and hedging fields had been underway. It happened more in certain parts of the country than others, but by the mid-1700s, enclosure was stepping up a gear.
The impact on the landscape was enormous. The Midlands in particular were severely affected by enclosure. It was the great landscape reshaper. Many poor and smaller farmers lost out at that time. They were often given allotments which were uneconomic, and they sold them out, and they became a kind of landless proletariat, if you like, who thereafter had to sell their own labour for money rather than having land to live off. So it affected enormously both the landscape and society at the time.
I hear Aylesbury has some pretty good enclosure records showing just how things changed. Enclosure replaced the strip field system. But what happened when the strips disappeared? Lee Shaw Taylor is the man with the answers.
This is drawn up in 1799. It's a map of Western Turville, which is just south of Aylesbury. Prior to the enclosure, there were three very large open fields, one here, and one here, and another small one down here.
So big fields, but still with the tiny strips?
Yeah, that's right. So as a result of enclosure, the commissioners, having decided who had what land and what rights, then reallocated people, consolidated blocks of land. So you can see Elizabeth Sanders, for instance, gets this big rectangular piece of land here. The Mercer's Company gets this block here.
And here.
And another piece here. Yep, they're big landowners. Marquis of Buckingham gets this one here.
The received wisdom is that enclosure took away the farming rights of the peasantry. Not strictly true. By the 1750s, enclosure was regulated by government. You needed an Act of Parliament, and about 4,000 such acts were passed by 1810. As part of the process, a committee would visit your village to establish who had common right dwellings, the cottages owned or rented with rights to use the land. Lee followed up a number of these. Robert Fitkin owned one cottage. His tenant, James Burnham, was a labourer, and he would have lost his rights to land with enclosure. But interestingly, he was untypical. Only 6 of this village's 50 labourers had common land rights. And what you don't have to begin with, you can't lose.
And so who are the winners? I mean, who's really benefiting from this situation?
Definitely big landlords who get higher rents. I mean, rents can double at enclosure. And probably farmers, the more substantial farmers.
And can you still see the physical effects of it in Western Turville today?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the landscape Western Turville is very much the one created by Georgian enclosure.
Lee and I then headed off to find Robert Fitkin's common right cottage.
Yeah, you often get a lot of new roads laid out across the fields and so on, or where the fields were. Within the villages, the layout tends to be much the same.
I find it amazing that 6 million acres were enclosed. That's half the villages in the country.
Oh, here we are, Western Turville.
So what are we looking for on the map now?
Right, well, we're just approaching where this roundabout now was the village green, and we need to go left here. And in 1798, set back on the right-hand side of the road we're about to turn into, were 5 cottages. And that one we can see is the first one.
The one at the pub?
No, beyond the pub. The pub's more recent and has been built in front of these other buildings. The green was wider. That's the second one.
Do you think it's this half-timbered one?
Well, they're both half-timbered, so it's not immediately obvious which is the older of these two.
Hello.
We're looking at the 1798 enclosure map and think this might be a house that belonged to a carpenter called Robert Fitkin.
I certainly bought the house off of Fitkin,
Really?
Benjamin, who claimed to be an architect, but I think was really a jobbing builder. The Robert, I don't know.
Right,
A
no.
bit
well,
early.
okay.
And I bought it 40 years ago.
40 years ago.
Gosh, because the one that we're looking at would have been alive 200 years ago,
Yeah.
so...
Well, this must be the house, although is this 2 houses?
This is 2 houses. I bought it as 2 separate houses
Right.
and made it into one.
Right.
So it probably is it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or it's one of the 2 anyway.
We're going to go and
So-
see if we can find an enclosed field now.
Okay. Look, there's a ridge and fire.
Yeah.
Incredible that. There were Fitkins living in that cottage for over 200 years.
So if we walk down here, we should come to where the middle field used to be before the enclosure.
So they're really quite useful maps like this
Yeah, I mean,
even in a modern
you
village?
can still use this map to find your way around the village, and the footpath still cuts diagonally across this field here, which is exactly how it's shown on the Enclosure Commissioner's map of 1799. So for 200 years it hasn't shifted at all.
Yeah, it's very good that it's still a footpath.
And it exits, in the far corner. So this field is just as it was laid out by the Enclosure Commissioners. And here we are. This is the ridge and furrow right here. You see the ridge.
Absolutely,
And you see them repeated. Each one of these was one of the strips that we were looking at, or like one of the strips we were looking at in the map of Salisbury.
So
And looking in that direction, there would have been not a hedge in sight,
right, you'd have...
but just hundreds and hundreds of these strips at various orientations.
So how come these strips have survived enclosure?
Right. Well, these strips are actually made originally by people ploughing round the strip and ploughing up one side and down the other, and the ploughs turning the soil into the middle, and people did that repeatedly for hundreds of years. Now this field must have been put down to pasture immediately after enclosure, so it's not been ploughed, and because it's been pasture ever since, this pattern's never been disturbed.
Is it possible to say generally whether they were a good or a bad thing?
Depends very much who you were, I think. I mean, it was very clearly a good thing for landlords and farmers. For labourers, it's much more of a mixed bag. I mean, the 6 labourers here who lost common rights to enclosure, it was probably catastrophic. For the much larger group who didn't have any, then it very much depends on whether employment went up here afterwards or went down. In the long run, I think it's inconceivable that agriculture could have stayed in the state that it was and still be there 200 years later.
Meanwhile, Michael and Rachel continue the fight against the airport. At the Public Record Office, they're trying to find out how the land which became Bentwaters Airfield was used in the past.
So this is the tithe map of 1840 for Rendlesham Parish, which you thought might be a good idea to look at. I suggest what we try and do is find Walnut Tree Farm, because we know that's in the middle of the present Bentwaters site. And that, I think, there's Walnut Tree Farm.
And that has been completely subsumed
Yeah.
by the airport. There's Wood.
So what we can see from this is, very sadly, there was no common land by 1840. Okay.
They then turned to a survey, commissioned in 1910 by the Liberal Prime Minister, Lloyd George.
Let's see if we can find the one that's got Walnut Tree Farm, because that's the sort of central one.
There's Walnut Tree Farm.
Oh, now what have we got?
There's
Yeah?
Bentwaters. Look, a pair of little semi-detached cottages.
How splendid.
That's how it got its name.
Oh, that's what I'm fascinating. That makes the search worth it.
Absolutely.
But otherwise, it's all the same, isn't it? No changes to speak of at all. It's incredible.
And of course, this area was littered, literally, with various American bases throughout the war.
And British fighter.
And British, most of which have now been ground up and returned to agricultural use.
Agricultural use, yes.
If only.
So what do we find? No common land. If only we could have had common land, then we would have had the same arguments as they had at Greenham Common, which succeeded there. Well, we must fight on other battlefields, but there are no surprises here. That's one thing.
Well, Michael and Rachel must now pin their hopes on the report which the local council has commissioned into how the airfield should be used in the future. Well into the 1800s, land was wealth and status. It gave you power locally and, more likely than not, nationally. Landowners dominated government. If you weren't a landowner, it was virtually impossible to get a peerage. And if you didn't have land and wealth, you couldn't even vote. But things started to change during Victoria's reign. Certain reformers argued that too much land was concentrated in the hands of too few people. But they didn't have hard facts to back up their case. In the 1870s, the Prime Minister, Lord Derby, vehemently denied their claim, and to prove his point, he commissioned a survey of land ownership throughout the British Isles. The survey of 1872 listed by county all the people who owned land, how much they had, and what it was worth. It also produced a mass of indigestible statistics, which needed someone to analyse them.
When the survey was actually looked at by a man called John Bateman, whose book of the Acreocracy of England was published 2 or 3 years later after the survey was done, what he actually came up with was the notion that something like 25% of the land of England and Wales was actually owned by about 700 great people, and that a huge proportion of the land was owned by something, by a few thousand people. So it was actually, it boomeranged back on him, and really it did show that at that time still landed wealth was very, very prominent.
The Derby survey made crystal clear what many had believed, and the political fallout was enormous. In the 1880s, renewed demands for electoral change led to the Third Reform Act of 1884-5. 60% of all men, 2/3 of them working class, were given the vote. Democratic power was supplanting the landowners forever. As Disraeli predicted, the politics of the next few years would be dominated by a tax on the landed interest. I'm off to Scotland, where some of the largest estates were to be found. There's no doubt that landowners were in a crisis at the end of the 19th century. There might only be a few powerful families, but they were worried. Worried by global food production, by the new rich buying into land, and by liberal reformers who, spurred on by the results of the Derby survey, might do something radical. The landowners were nervous. They could see a weakening of the traditional link between landowning and political power. By 1910, a Liberal Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, decided they were ripe for plucking.
Lloyd George's idea was to value the land in 1909 or thereafter and tax any appreciation in the capital value thereafter. And the landlords were politically unpopular among advanced liberal opinion. So that's why he wanted his survey.
The entries in the survey are detailed. Take this one for the Earl of Galloway.
Galloway House. Parks, house, offices and garden, lodges, cottages and gardens, smithy, sawmill and part of woodlands and shootings, everything. And you turn over the page, Galloway House, back to the grandeur. Dining room, double library, drawing room, boudoirs, private chapel, billiard room, several sitting rooms, nurseries, over 30 bedrooms.
Wow.
He lost count at that stage.
Yes.
Now that was still carrying on. The grandeur's there, but I've been pointing out, when you look at the financial records, they're under pressure.
The Galloway rent ledger showed us a problem with one of the tenant farmers that seemed to sum it all up.
At the beginning of 1895, 100 years ago, the tenant was in arrears to the tune of £741. At the end of the year, £796. At the end of 1896, £867. 1897, £923. The arrears were rising.
Now that surprises me, I have to say, because I'm interested that they're allowed to get away with that. Because you think of the landlord-tenant relationship as being a much harsher one, that if you didn't pay up your rent, you're out. Absolutely.
Yes, exactly. Well, sometimes that happened, but what I'm trying to point out is there is another side when you get beneath the obvious and beneath the political propaganda which was growing at the time.
Right.
Here's an example of that same tenant writing in 1899 when his arrears were coming up on £1,000. I'm sorry to say that I will not be able to make a large payment at the end of the month owing to missing the sale of my cattle last back end, that's the autumn, and no prospect of selling them before the May market. A little later, I'm informed that you give tiles for drains when the tenants open them up. So you can see he's not paying all his rent, the arrears are mounting, but he's still expecting the landowner to provide the assistance he needs.
It's interesting that Lloyd George should then commission his survey, out of which he hoped to make a lot of money.
Yes, but it's interesting that the affluent landowners were usually those who had non-agricultural or non-landed resources. But if you were solely dependent on agricultural land and it wasn't top quality, then you were in difficulties.
It's very interesting that Winston Churchill, who was working side by side with Lloyd George as a liberal, as he was in those days, referred to it as the weeping of the dismal dukes. But they were very worried that there were people within the liberal ranks who would like to see that survey or the results of a full list of who owned what and how much it was worth being used in the future for land nationalisation.
That, of course, never happened. But the Galloway estate was typical of estates all over the country, which, faced with rising costs, falling income and death duties, were broken up and sold. Mind you, looked at as a whole, the 20th century didn't see the massive changes in ownership that you might have expected. Arguably, it's our land records and what they don't tell us that have protected the landlord's interests.
It's only been since 1994 that landowners have been legally required to register their land, and only then when it changes hands. Of course, that doesn't include huge tracts of the country that have been owned by the same institutions for generations. It's also only since the 1990s that the public have had access to who owns what here at the Land Registry, and even now there's no record of what the land is worth. As the centuries have progressed, landowners have become increasingly good at keeping that information to themselves.
A couple of months on, and at last Suffolk Coastal District Council has published the report of the inquiry it commissioned into local military bases.
Rachel.
Hello there.
There. Have you seen this?
Rachel and Michael are delighted with it.
Tell me all about it. Good news, isn't it? I think so. Although securing economic benefits for the community is a laudable aim, there is no evidence to suggest that these benefits could be delivered only by an airport development. Other, less intrusive and harmful options for reusing the base should be explored.
Says it all.
Now, does this mean it's all over?
No, it doesn't, because the planning committee and the full council have to decide whether to accept it.
At 7 o'clock, they attend a meeting to hear whether the council will accept the report.
All those in favour? Those against? 2.
So, the air park on the Bentwaters site will not now go ahead.
I think the word was out that the decision had been taken, and therefore the people who are very much in favour of an airport didn't bother to show up, and I think that's probably quite sensible.
There is a real possibility that we can help to restore perhaps something of the heath, of the forest, and indeed the very profitable agriculture that went on there.
Yeah. Greenham Common is the nearest example we have, where there was an old American airbase which turned into a successful science park or industrial zone, and there's no reason why that shouldn't happen here.
The pressure on land usage today is enormous. The demand for houses, motorways and out-of-town shopping has made knowledge of the ownership of land all the more valuable. It's an astonishing thought that perhaps more was known about who owned what at the time of the Doomsday Book than is known today. But there may come a time when the simple need to know who owns this cramped island forces a future government to compile a 21st century Doomsday survey. Digitally, of course. There's more about this programme and about how you can use documents to bring history to life on the BBC History website. Or there's a phone number you can ring to find out about other sources you can use and places you can visit.